Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 93, So That Our Candle Does Not Go Out. Welcome back. With Episode 100 coming up, some of you may be wondering if there will be another Q&A episode. We're now in the final stretch of Season 1, so my plan is to carry on through to the end and then have a Q&A episode before we start Season 2. Thank you to everyone who subscribed while I was taking my holiday. Your support is much appreciated. We left off with the deaths of the rulers of Moscow, Lithuania, and the Horde. In Moscow, Ivan Kalita's succession planning efforts bore fruit. The Khan had approved his will, and his son Simeon, known as the Proud, followed his father onto the throne of the Grand Knyaz. The transfer of power from father to son seemed like a success. Simeon began strongly, coming through in the chronicles as a more dynamic figure than his father, who took decisive action, whether he was engaged in war or diplomacy. Simeon took the throne against a backdrop of increasing Lithuanian pressure. The new Grand Duke, Algirdas, was testing the frontier, looking to bring more Rus territory under his control. Moscow was relying on its relations with the Horde to deter major conflict. The details are quite difficult to extract from the chronicles due to later revisions that set out to create a narrative of Lithuanian aggression and Moscow resistance that probably does not accurately reflect the actual events in what scholars believe was more characterized by diplomatic containment and maneuvering rather than open warfare. In any case, a Lithuanian incursion towards Mazhaisk ended inconclusively without a battle. In 1348, the Lithuanians sent emissaries to the Horde. In older historiography, this was sometimes presented as the Lithuanians attempting to form an alliance with the Mongols against Simeon, which is rejected as implausible in modern scholarship, given that Simeon was a Horde vassal holding a Yarlik from the Khan. Instead, it's possible that the Lithuanians were bringing some kind of complaint to the Khan against Simeon as that vassal, perhaps in connection with border skirmishing. Simeon's envoys skillfully played up the Lithuanian threat to Horde interests. The Khan was persuaded that the Lithuanians were his enemies and handed their envoys over to the Muscovites. The Lithuanians were humiliated by this. Simeon's standing rose, and the Lithuanians thought better of confrontation and turned their attention to the south. In 1351, Simeon launched a campaign against Smolensk. At that time, Smolensk was very much contested territory, a buffer zone between Moscow's zone of influence and the Lithuanians, with the Lithuanians prevailing in recent times. Simeon had clear Horde backing, which determined the balance of military power, and again pushed the conflict towards negotiations and containment rather than open battle. Lithuania withdrew and Smolensk acknowledged Moscow's suzerainty. In contrast to his father, who was seen as carrying out the tasks he was given by the Khan, Simeon is depicted in modern scholarship as an active and decisive figure who used Horde backing to achieve his own aims. He was similarly decisive in his dealings with Novgorod. Before the city even had a chance to accept him as knyaz, he had already appointed a governor to Torzhok. When Novgorod sent an army to defend the town, Simeon summoned the knyazes of the northeast and marched in overwhelming force, with Metropolitan Fyodnas beside him. The boyars of Novgorod had no option but to surrender, accept him as knyaz, and atone for their resistance by granting him additional tax revenues. But whatever his talents may have been, Simeon faced an enemy that no one could defeat. As his key ally, Metropolitan Fyodnas, died, and the people of Moscow suffered, he drew up his will with desperate words. I write this that the memory of our parents and of us may not die, and so that the candle may not go out. Within weeks, Simeon, both his sons, and one of his two younger brothers were all dead. All that effort to establish a stable succession, and the ruling house of Moscow was almost wiped out within a generation. The Black Death had arrived in the northeastern Knyazhestva. The bubonic plague, transmitted by fleas carried by a variety of animals but brought to humans primarily by rats, is endemic in the steppe. Even today, occasional cases among hunters continue to occur, although it's no longer a fatal prognosis. The Mongols were familiar with outbreaks, and surviving records show them moving camps and altering nomadization territories to avoid infection. The outbreak that led to the Black Death started in the territory of the Great Horde. From there, it was carried to Europe by Italian ships sailing from Kaffa, and it travelled the whole way around Europe before reaching Moscow from the west. The chronicle entry for the year 1346 tells us how it began. Quote, in the same year, God's punishment struck the people of the eastern land. In Tarna, Astrakhan, New Sarai, and Bezdyezh, and other towns and cities of those lands, the mortality was great among the Besemens, the Tartars, the Armenians, the Abkhazians, the Jews, and the foreigners. That means the Western Europeans, the Circassians, and all who lived there, so that they were not able to bury them. End quote. Here the chronicler mentions the cities of the Horde in the steppe, where the plague outbreak would have begun, and Tarna, the Venetian trading town, which had been taken over by the Genoese at this point. The Horde had mounted punitive campaigns against the Italians over the previous couple of years, including a long siege of Kaffa. Tarna had been used as a logistical centre for supplying the troops with large volumes of food, which arrived in the town and was sent on to the troops. And large volumes of food always attracted rats. From Kaffa, Italian galleys travelled to Constantinople, where Nicephorus Gregoras wrote, quote, during that time, a severe epidemic broke out, starting in Scythia and Myotis and the mouth of the Tanais, that's the Don. As the spring began, it lasted the whole year, spreading widely and devastatingly. End quote. The Rus chronicles report the plague spreading around the Black Sea and the Caspian and moving towards the south. It reached Azerbaijan and Tabriz, the capital of the Ilkhanate, by late summer. By the same time, it reached the Byzantine rump state of Trebizond, carried by slaves purchased in Crimea. The cold weather of autumn suppressed the outbreak, but it had already spread far enough to create a reservoir of infection that would reappear in the spring. Many of you will likely have heard the story that the plague was started by the Mongols catapulting corpses into Kaffa. This comes from Gabriel de Musis, a notary in Piacenza, who gathered information from merchants returning to Italy. He was a contemporary, but not an eyewitness. His sources reported the citizens of Kaffa watching the besieging Mongols, devastated by the disease, resorting out of desperation to trying to infect the defenders. Quote, "The bodies of the dead were hurled over the walls, so that Christians were not able to hide or protect themselves from this danger, although they carried away as many dead as possible and threw them into the sea. But soon the whole air became infected and the water poisoned, and a pestilence grew up such that scarcely 1 out of 1,000 was able to escape." End quote. Even some modern historians have taken this story at face value. But recall our recent episodes. The Mongols had, by this point, officially converted to Islam, which requires burial of the dead with certain rituals within 24 hours. Even leaving that aside, consider the bonds of friendship and honor among warriors fighting and dying alongside each other. Does it sound likely that they would so mistreat their fallen comrades' bodies by using them as ammunition? Science also gives us an understanding that de Musis and his informers lacked. Corpses of people who have died of the plague are not contagious. The bubonic plague is only transmitted by infected fleas. Such fleas could indeed have been in the clothing of the dead, but fleas instinctively abandon a body as soon as it begins to cool. Rather than bodies, the most likely explanation for the plague entering the city is that it was carried by rats in the army's provisions, leaving the Mongols to look for more food as the army ate its way through its stores. So where does the story come from? Think back to the usual explanation for disasters at this time. This was a conflict between Muslim Mongols and Christian Italians. The standard explanation that they would have resorted to when they saw the plague break out among the besiegers is that it was God's punishment of the unbelievers. We just heard the Rus Chronicle referring to the plague as God's punishment on the people of the eastern lands. This approach would have become untenable when the city's defenders also fell sick. So, whoever brought the story back to Italy turned to the main theory of infections of the time, miasma. In the contemporary understanding, the plague must have been spread through the foul smells of the decaying victims. And so someone invented the story of Mongols throwing bodies into the city to explain how those rotting corpses, carrying the sickness, could have reached the defenders. In fact, the Mongols were hard enough hit by the plague that they had to abandon their siege and go home. This spared the city, which meant that as the autumn appeared to relieve the epidemic, it returned to its normal activities, sending out ships with potential plague carriers to Genoa, Venice, and other destinations. But why did the Mongols not spread it to the Rus? This comes down to Janibeg Khan, Ozbek's successor. His campaigns against the Italians had been part of moves early in his reign to ban Muslims trading with Christians. We do not have specific information that this ban extended to his own Orthodox subjects, but if it did, it would explain why the outbreak did not spread to the north. It would take 5 years for the plague to spread around Europe in an arc through the Mediterranean to northwestern Europe, Germany, and then the Baltic, before it finally arrived in the northeastern Kняжество, the last region of Europe to succumb. In Western Europe, the Black Death has been the subject of extensive study. Any schoolchild can tell you that 30 to 50% of the population was killed, and that this massive loss led to dramatic social transformation. The labour shortage lasted for generations. Peasants and workers suddenly found themselves with the power to demand higher wages and better conditions. Serfdom weakened or collapsed as labourers moved to take new work. Landlords struggled to keep control of rural populations and maintain their estates. This story of worker power goes directly against Marxist orthodoxy as originally formulated and taken up and developed by Lenin and Stalin before modern scholarship on the plague existed. So, in the Soviet Union and other communist countries, particularly Poland, the Black Death was ignored, or regime historians even argued that it had never reached Eastern Europe. In Russia, between a major study in 1906 and the 21st century, the subject was given barely any attention. Even in Western works, due to the lack of materials, you will often find the whole epidemic dismissed in a paragraph, saying something along the lines of, "We assume it was just as bad as elsewhere, but let's move on." Actually, the impact of the plague was quite different in the East, and less problematic for Marxists. The plague reached the lands of the Teutonic Order in Prussia by 1349, hitting Elbing and then spreading to other cities, carried to the Hanseatic towns by ships from Germany. The chronicles state that the Black Death raged across Prussia and Pomerania, destroying innumerable lives of women and men. By 1351, the whole of the Baltic region was in its grip. The chronicles state that mortality in Livonia reached its maximum in 1351. Merchants brought the plague to Pskov in 1352. As the outbreak escalated, the city's governors sent messengers to Archbishop Vasily of Novgorod, declaring their repentance and begging him to come and pray for God to end their punishment. The archbishop agreed, journeying to Pskov and blessing the townspeople and local priests. The chronicle continues, quote, "Then he left them healthy to return to Novgorod, but fell severely ill on the road and died at the river Uz on 3rd of July. He was brought to Novgorod and buried. In the same summer there was a terribly violent disease in Novgorod and all over the territory of Novgorod and in the towns of Lake Ladoga." End quote. The chronicles report the disease spreading far and wide that summer, reaching Smolensk, Kiev, Chernihiv, and Suzdal, causing what the chronicler calls a ferocious, meaningless, and quick death. In Bielozero, he reports that no one survived. The infection probably reached Moscow the same year, but too late for a serious outbreak. Here the disease would run rampant in 1353. The chronicler writes, quote, In the year 1353, the most holy Theognost, Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, died on the 11th of March and was buried on the 13th of March. In the same week, the two sons of the Grand Knyaz Simeon Ivanovich died. 40 days after the death of Theognost, the Grand Knyaz Simeon Ivanovich died and was buried in his patrimony in Moscow, in the Church of the Holy Archangel Michael. On the 43rd day after the death of the Grand Knyaz Simeon Ivanovich, his brother Knyaz Andrei Ivanovich died and was buried in Moscow in the same Church of the Holy Archangel Michael. On the 40th day after the death of Knyaz Andrei Ivanovich, his carnal son, Prince Vladimir, died. End quote. Transmission to Moscow probably happened in a similar fashion to that from Pskov to Novgorod. The death of Archbishop Vasily meant that the city boyars had to send messengers to Theognost in Moscow asking for a new bishop. This delegation arrived in Moscow at the end of September, when the weather was already cooling. Perhaps with a plague-bearing rat hitching a ride in their supplies and taking up residence in the Metropolitan's palace to wait for the spring, and Theognost becoming the first of those prominent deaths mentioned in the chronicle. The chronicles continue to refer to the spread of the plague across the Knyazhestvo through the following year, which, although localized outbreaks continued, marked the end of the European epidemic. They do not give details about how it spread or its impact, but we can understand some things nevertheless. The gap in the study of the Black Death in Russia, combined with the general shortage of sources from the region, allowed the opinion to form that the low, by comparison with Western Europe, population density in the region meant that people lived in isolation. Family homesteads that did not communicate, living by subsistence farming. The scant records in the chronicles, though, show that the Black Death spread through the Knyazhestvo in the same patterns and at around the same speed that it did elsewhere, carried by travellers and trade goods, especially on the rivers. So just because we lack specific evidence for the internal movements of ordinary people, that assumption that they were tied down in small isolated settlements and did not communicate with each other does not appear to have been true. The assumption that the Black Death was just as deadly as in Western Europe seems more justified, although we do not have the depth of records that existed in, say, England. The Pskov Chronicle tells us, quote, "Because of the great numbers of the dying, priests could not bring the dead from their homes one at a time, so they ordered the people to bring their own dead to the churchyard. In one night, 30 or more bodies could be brought for burial in a single church. They received a communal funeral service, with hymns but with each man, woman and child being given absolution individually. 3 to 5 bodies were placed in each grave. That is how it was in every church. All the graveyards were filled, and there was nowhere to bury the dead. So the land outside of the churches and graveyards was dug up, and the dead were buried there. No matter what class of people the sickness affected, be it rulers, the rich, common people, or even the poor, it was terribly deadly. Over half died very quickly. Others perished with suffering. Few survived." End quote. It's unlikely that quite everyone died in Biele Ozero or Gluchov, as the chronicler suggests. but it was probably not much of an exaggeration, and an example of reports that we have from across Europe, where the people setting down the records became overwhelmed by the horror of days in which it did indeed seem as if everyone was dying. The lack of records makes it hard to assess the social impact of the Black Death in the Kняжество. This does not mean that it was any lesser. As I mentioned a moment ago about the spread of the Black Death undermining assumptions about the level of connections among communities, the absence of information does not mean that something did not happen. But in contrast to Western Europe, serfdom barely existed in the East, and manorial estates were few. Peasants were already able to move around, and land was already abundant. So the Black Death did not create the same kind of conditions for a revolution in peasant wages. If anything, it was the opposite. Power became more concentrated. The labour shortage pushed elites towards imposing serfdom to try and keep the peasants in place. Lords and monasteries increased centralised control, and peasant obligations started to become more rigidly defined. The monasteries in particular, which we've already heard were boosted by Mongol tax policies, accumulated land that had been abandoned and began imposing tighter bonds on the peasants that worked it. Labour and trade were disrupted in the cities, particularly in Novgorod, which did cause social stress. But the Kняжество did not see widespread wage bargaining or peasant revolts. This does not mean that the Black Death did not have an impact in the East comparable to the West. It had a different impact, but it was still highly significant, and there are many scholars who argue that it was a turning point. For the Rus, the loss of population in certain regions is a contributing factor to the coming expansion of Moscow. It had a major impact on religiosity. Again, there's a contrast with the West. While in the West, the Black Death undermined the authority of the Church, and numerous alternative, usually mystical religious movements appeared. In the East, the Orthodox Church strengthened its position. But most of all, the Black Death hit the steppe differently to sedentary populations. The death rates were more spatially uneven, hitting the cities worse than mobile populations, collapsing trade routes and tribute flows, which directly affected the basis of political power. Although we should not assign single causes to complex processes, there are good arguments for the Black Death being the tipping point at which the steppes' centuries-old ability to militarily dominate their sedentary neighbours goes into decline. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.